Welcome to Love DoOver, where every story is a journey through heartbreak, healing, and rediscovery. In this story, she lost him to war at 18. 19 years later, he returned with 300 unopened letters. We dive deep into the raw human emotions that make love both beautiful and devastating. Before we begin, remember this: if you've ever loved and lost, or thought you'll never find love again, this story is for you. Subscribe and turn on notifications to never miss a new tale of heartbreak and rebirth. Liliana was 17 when she buried her mother. The priest spoke gently, as if softness could change what had happened. People from the neighborhood cafe stood in small groups, whispering about how sudden it had been. Only 3 weeks earlier, her mother had been arguing with a supplier about the price of oranges. Then came the hospital room, the machines, the silence. Liliana stood beside the grave holding her own elbows because she did not know what else to do with her arms. Someone pressed a tissue into her hand. She did not cry right away. She kept thinking, I still need her to explain where the flour is kept. I still need her to tell me how to fix the espresso machine when it makes that strange sound. Later that afternoon, when everyone left, she went back to the cafe alone. The shutters were half closed. The chalkboard still read, "Fresh lemon tart today." She erased it slowly. The sound of chalk scraping felt louder than it should have. The next morning, she locked the front door and turned the sign to closed. It felt permanent in a way she did not like. 3 days later, the lawyer handed her a small wooden box that had belonged to her mother. "This is yours now," he said gently, as if she had won something instead of lost everything. She opened it that night at the kitchen table. Inside were letters tied with faded ribbon and an old photograph of a man standing in front of a building she did not recognize. On the back of the photo was written a name and a city: Vienna. Her father. She stared at the word for a long time. She had asked about him only once when she was 10. Her mother had said, "He is someone who lives far away," and then had changed the subject to homework. Liliana had learned not to ask again. Now the letters told a different story. They were written in careful handwriting. Some of them were affectionate. Some were tense. One said, "I hope one day she will want to know me." The date was from before she was born. Liliana leaned back in her chair and let out a small laugh that did not feel like laughter. "Well, that's convenient," she muttered. "Now you're available." Over the following week, she read every letter twice. They hinted at arguments, distance, pride. They did not explain why he had never visited. They did not explain why her mother had kept him a secret, but also kept every word he ever wrote. At night, she lay in bed staring at the ceiling. She told herself she did not need anyone. She was almost 18. She could manage the cafe. She could figure out taxes. She could survive. Then, 2 weeks after the funeral, she walked into the train station with a single suitcase and the wooden box tucked inside it. "I'm not running," she told herself while buying the ticket to Vienna. "I'm investigating." The train ride felt longer than it was. She watched the landscape change through the window and wondered if her father would recognize her face. She tried to picture him opening the door and saying her name like he had been practicing it for years. Then she imagined him frowning, confused, annoyed. The next morning, the train pulled into Vienna. The station was loud and orderly at the same time. People moved quickly, speaking German in tones that felt sharp to her ears. The buildings outside were tall and pale, nothing like the warm stone streets she knew. Even the air felt different, cooler and less forgiving. She stepped onto the platform and immediately felt younger than 17. "I can do this," she whispered. "I have survived worse." She had not, but it sounded convincing. Later that afternoon, after wandering in circles with her suitcase, she stopped a woman on the street. "Excuse me," she said carefully, holding out the photograph. "Do you know where this is?" The woman glanced at it and answered quickly in German. Liliana caught only every third word. She nodded anyway, pretending she understood, then walked in the direction she hoped was correct. By early evening, her feet hurt and her confidence had thinned. She clutched the photograph tighter, scanning street signs she could not pronounce. That was when it happened. She turned a corner too fast and collided directly into someone. Her suitcase tipped, papers flew. The wooden box slid halfway out. "I am so sorry," a male voice said immediately. "I should have been looking up." She looked up, ready to snap, and found herself staring at a boy about her age. His dark hair fell into his eyes. He held a sketchbook in one hand, pencil tucked behind his ear. "Well, you weren't," she said sharply, looking up. He blinked, surprised, then smiled in a way that irritated her because it seemed too calm. "You're right. I was not." He crouched to gather her scattered papers. She dropped to her knees too, reaching for the photograph before he could see it. "Is that your father?" he asked gently, noticing it anyway. "That's none of your business," she replied, then immediately felt foolish. Why was she attacking strangers? He held up his hands slightly. "I only asked because you look like him." She froze. "I do not." He tilted his head. "You do." She did not want him to be correct. While she argued with him about genetics, he picked up his pencil and, almost without looking, began sketching. She noticed after a moment. "Are you drawing me?" she demanded. "I draw what stands still long enough," he answered lightly. "Right now, that is you." "I am not standing still." "You are arguing very still." She almost laughed and hated that she almost laughed. "Keep your drawing," she said as she stood, brushing dust from her coat. "I don't even know you." "I am Theodore," he said. She hesitated, then shook her head. "Good for you." She pulled her suitcase upright and walked away before he could respond. A few steps later, she glanced back despite herself. He was still standing there watching her, sketchbook pressed to his chest. That night, in a narrow boarding room that smelled faintly of old soap, she finally cried. She cried for her mother. She cried for the cafe. She cried because Vienna felt enormous, and she felt temporary inside it. And she cried because for the first time since arriving, someone had looked at her like she was not just a girl carrying a box. She turned onto her side and stared at the wooden lid peeking out of her suitcase. "Tomorrow," she whispered, though she did not know what tomorrow was supposed to bring. The next morning in Vienna, Theodore woke up to the sound of his father clearing his throat downstairs, which was a warning more than a noise. It meant breakfast would be silent and punctual, and opinions would be served without invitation. Theodore slid his sketchbook under a loose floorboard before leaving his room. He had measured that board carefully over the years. It lifted just enough to hide what mattered. At the kitchen table, his father folded the newspaper with precision. "You were out late," he said without looking up. "It was barely evening," Theodore replied, reaching for bread. "You are 18 now. It is time you think about serious work." Theodore knew what was coming. It always came. "I'm thinking about work." "Art is decoration for weak men," his father said flatly. "It feeds no one. It builds nothing." Theodore chewed slowly and said nothing. He had learned that defending himself only made the lecture longer. Inside his head, though, he was arguing fiercely. Paintings build something. They build memory. They build feeling. But those sentences would not survive the kitchen table. Later that afternoon, he escaped to the canal with his sketchbook tucked under his arm. The air was cooler near the water, and people moved more slowly there. He liked observing faces that did not belong to his house. That was when he saw her again. Liliana stood near the edge of the canal, turning a photograph back and forth as if the right angle might make the building appear in front of her. She looked irritated, which he found familiar. He hesitated for a second, then walked toward her. "You are still colliding with strangers?" he asked. She looked up sharply. "You again?" "Yes, I live here. It is difficult to avoid me." She narrowed her eyes, then glanced down at the photograph in her hand. "Do you know where this is?" He leaned closer, careful not to invade her space. "That street is near the old clock tower, about 15 minutes from here." She sighed, which sounded like relief mixed with annoyance. "I have been walking for an hour." "That is because you keep turning the wrong way," he said lightly. "I do not." "You do. Your accent betrays you." "My accent does nothing," she shot back. He smiled. "It does everything." She should have walked away. He could see that calculation in her expression, but she did not. "Fine," she said. "Show me." As they walked through the narrow streets, she kept a small distance between them. He noticed she held the photograph tightly like it might escape. Is he important? Theodore asked carefully. He is my father, she replied. Apparently. That single word hung between them. The following week had not yet passed, but already he felt that she carried something heavier than luggage. Apparently, he repeated. My mother died, she said suddenly, as if the sentence had been waiting for permission. 3 weeks ago. He stopped walking for a moment. I am sorry. She shrugged and the movement looked forced. People keep saying that. I do not know what to do with it. He understood that. You do not have to do anything with it. They reached a small coffee stall by the canal. He gestured toward it. You look like someone who needs caffeine. I look like someone who needs directions, she corrected. You can need both. She hesitated, then nodded. Fine, but I am paying. You cannot even pronounce the currency properly. She gave him a look that almost made him laugh. I can learn. They stood side by side, waiting for their coffee. She stared at the water. He stared at her profile, noticing the tension in her jaw. My father thinks art is decoration for weak men, he said suddenly. She turned toward him. What? I thought we were confessing things. She blinked, then surprised him by smiling faintly. And is he right? No, he replied quickly, but he pays the bills. She took a sip of her coffee and made a face at the bitterness. My mother paid the bills. Now there are no bills because there is no cafe. He waited. I thought if I found him, she continued, glancing at the photograph again, he would at least look happy to see me. That seems reasonable. It does, Theodore said. Later that evening, after he had walked her closer to the address on the photograph, she stopped in front of a tall building and stared at it as if it might reject her. This is it, he said quietly. She nodded, but did not move. What if he does not remember me? He will. You do not know that. You look like him, Theodore said gently. She exhaled, then squared her shoulders. If he is terrible, I am blaming you. That seems fair. Before she could knock, she turned back to him. Why are you helping me? He considered the question honestly. Because you look lost, and because I would like someone to help me when I am. She studied him for a second, as if deciding whether he was trustworthy. Meet me tomorrow, she said finally. 9 o'clock, by the clock tower. Why 9? Because I need a specific time, she answered. Otherwise I might change my mind. He nodded. 9, then. That night, at his family home, his father spoke about apprenticeships and respectable careers, while Theodore listened with half his attention. The other half was replaying her expression when she said, my mother died. The next morning, Liliana walked into her father's building alone. An hour later, she stepped back out with her shoulders tighter than before. He had not embraced her. He had not even touched her. He had asked about legal documents and inheritance arrangements before asking how she was. By 9 that evening, she was already standing by the clock tower when Theodore arrived. Well, he asked carefully. She looked at him and forced a laugh. He is very interested in paperwork. That sounds thrilling. It is not, she replied. I expected something else. I do not know what. Fireworks, apologies, a hug, something. He did not offer advice. He did not tell her to be patient. He simply stood beside her. As she spoke, he pulled out his sketchbook quietly and began to draw. She noticed, but pretended she did not. Are you doing it again? She asked after a minute. Doing what? Turning me into decoration for weak men. He smiled. I am turning you into color. She looked at him, and for the first time since arriving in Vienna, her expression softened without effort. Fragile hope, though neither of them would have used that word, settled between them at 9 o'clock on a city street that suddenly felt less enormous. Over the next 2 months, 9 o'clock became theirs. The first few evenings felt cautious, like both of them were pretending this was temporary. By the end of the second week, they stopped pretending. Liliana would arrive early and pretend she had not. Theodore would arrive breathless and pretend he had not been running. One night near the canal, she crossed her arms and said, You are late. I am 3 minutes late. That is late. He checked the clock tower. You are becoming very Austrian. I am not, she said quickly, then paused. Am I? He grinned. A little. The next morning, after one of their 9 o'clock meetings had stretched into laughter and arguments about whether pigeons had personalities, Theodore led her through a narrow alley she had not noticed before. "Where are we going?" she asked. "To show you something illegal." She stopped walking. "Illegal. Emotionally illegal," he corrected. "Calm down." He unlocked a basement door beneath an old building and gestured for her to step inside. The room smelled faintly of paint and dust. Canvases leaned against the walls, some finished, some only beginnings. "You painted all of this?" she asked, walking slowly around the space. "Yes," he replied, suddenly unsure of himself. "Do not laugh." "I am not laughing." She moved closer to a painting of the canal at sunset. The water looked alive, not flat. She turned toward him. "Why are these hidden?" He shrugged. "My father prefers numbers." "And you prefer this?" "Yes." She looked at him carefully. "Then apply to art school." He blinked. "It is not that simple." "It is exactly that simple," she replied. "You apply. They say yes or no. Life continues. You say that like rejection is nothing." She thought about her father's expression when she first knocked on his door. "It is not nothing," she admitted, "but it is not death either." He studied her face. "You are braver than you look." "I look very brave," she said. "I have excellent posture." He laughed, and something inside her eased. Over the following week, he showed her Vienna differently. They sat on rooftops eating bread and cheese he claimed was affordable, though she suspected he was lying. He dragged her through markets, pointing out colors in vegetables like they were masterpieces. "Look at that red," he insisted one afternoon, holding up a tomato. "It is a tomato," she said. "It is ambition." She stared at him. "You need help." He only smiled. Meanwhile, her meetings with her father grew strained. The next morning, after one pleasant evening with Theodore, she sat across from her father at his polished dining table. "You should consider staying permanently," her father said, adjusting his cufflinks. "There are opportunities here if you are sensible." "Sensible," she repeated. "Yes, work in administration, something structured." "I ran a cafe," she said quietly. "I know how to work." "That was your mother's hobby." The word hit her harder than she expected. "It was not a hobby." He sighed. "You are young. You need guidance." She felt heat rise in her chest. "I crossed a country alone." That was impulsive. Later that evening at 9, she found Theodore already waiting. "He called my mother's cafe a hobby," she said without greeting. Theodore listened, leaning back against the stone wall. "He talks about structure like it is oxygen," she continued, "as if creativity is some disease." "You are not a disease," Theodore said gently. She looked at him. "I am loud. I argue. I do not fit here." "You take up space," he replied. "That is not a crime." She stared at the ground. "It feels like one." He stepped closer, not touching her yet. "It is not." That night, when she returned to her boarding room, she pulled out her mother's letters again. She read one where her mother had written, "I chose the life that made sense to me." She wondered what that had meant. Sensible had clearly not led to happiness. 2 weeks later, rain began falling just as 9 o'clock approached. Liliana almost did not go. She told herself she was tired. She told herself she did not need to see him every day, but she went anyway. He was already there, hair soaked, sketchbook tucked under his coat. "You look ridiculous," she said. "So do you." They stood under the clock tower as rain soaked the street. She began laughing first, then he did. It felt absurd and freeing at the same time. "I might leave," she said suddenly, though she had not planned to say it. "Leave Vienna?" "Yes," he swallowed. "Why?" "Because I do not belong here." He stepped closer, rain running down his face. "You belong wherever you decide to." She searched his eyes for hesitation and found none. That frightened her more than doubt would have. "I am afraid," she admitted. "Of what?" "Of needing something that disappears." He did not answer right away. Instead, he reached for her hand. She let him. The kiss happened without announcement. It was awkward at first because both of them were shivering and laughing. Then it settled into something steady, something that felt less like performance and more like recognition. When they finally pulled apart, She pressed her forehead against his. "If you do not apply to art school, I will never forgive you." He smiled faintly. "If you do not choose what you want, I will remind you daily." A few days later, he filled out the application forms in the basement studio while she watched. "I feel like I am betraying my father," he confessed. "You are not betraying him," she said. "You are choosing yourself." Later that evening, as they sat on a rooftop overlooking the opera district, he grew quiet. "Whatever happens," he said carefully, "I will write to you." She glanced at him. "That sounds serious." "It is." She studied his face, memorizing the certainty there. "I will write back," she replied. Across the city, in a house with polished floors, Theodore's father stood at the top of the stairs, listening. He had returned earlier than expected. He had heard enough of the conversation drifting through an open window to understand the word art school. He did not knock. He did not interrupt. He simply listened and made a decision. 3 days after the rooftop conversation, Liliana arrived at the clock tower at 9 o'clock with a folded piece of paper in her pocket. It was a list of practical things. If he gets into art school, celebrate. If he does not, pretend it does not matter. She had rehearsed the conversation in her head all afternoon. He did not come. She checked the time twice. Then again. 9 o'clock became 9:15. A carriage passed. A couple argued softly near the bakery. She told herself he was late. He had been late before. 3 minutes, she corrected herself. 3 minutes is not the same as 15. By 9:30, irritation replaced worry. "You are becoming unreliable," she muttered to the empty space beside her. The following night she returned at 9 sharp, pretending she had not considered skipping it. He was not there. She waited anyway. It began to feel humiliating, standing under a clock tower like a character in a sad play. At 9:40, she finally turned away. The next evening she went again. This time she lasted only 20 minutes before anger took over. Something is wrong, she thought, or he is avoiding me. The second option hurt more. The next morning, she marched toward Theodore's house with determination that surprised even her. If he had decided to vanish without explanation, she would at least demand the courtesy of a reason. His family home looked unchanged, tall and orderly. She knocked harder than necessary. The door opened to reveal his father, composed as always. "Yes?" he asked. "I am looking for Theodore." His father studied her face in a way that felt clinical. "He is not here." "I can see that," she replied tightly. "Where is he?" There was a pause long enough to make her uneasy. "He has been conscripted," the man said finally. She blinked. "Conscripted?" "For service," he clarified. "It will do him good." Her stomach dropped. "When?" 2 days ago. 2 days ago, while she had been standing under a clock tower waiting for a boy who had already been put on a train. "You sent him?" she asked, though she already knew. "He needed discipline," his father said calmly. "He was losing focus." "Losing focus," she repeated, trying to understand how painting could equal a war. "This conversation is unnecessary," he continued. "He will be fine." She felt something sharp inside her chest. Not tears, not yet. He did not even say goodbye. His father's expression did not change. There was no time. "There is always time," she wanted to shout. "You make time." Instead, she stood very still. She would not cry in this hallway. She would not give him that. "Where was he sent?" she asked. "That information is private." Private. The word echoed in her head. Later that afternoon, she walked without direction until her feet ached. The city felt unfamiliar again, as if the last 2 months had been borrowed. At 9 o'clock that evening, she did not go to the clock tower. She sat on her narrow bed instead, staring at the wall. He promised he would write, she thought, but he also promised to meet me. Anger came first. He should have told me, he should have found a way. Then guilt followed. Maybe he did not have a choice. That same night, she pulled out paper and began to write. "I went to your house today. Your father told me." She stopped and crossed out the sentence. It sounded accusing. "I hope you are safe. I am angry with you, but I think I am more angry at the situation." She paused again. Was that honest? She did not know. She wrote until the page was full, folded it carefully, and addressed it with trembling handwriting. The next morning she mailed it. 1 week passed, then 2. She checked the mailbox every day, pretending she was not checking. Each time it was empty, she told herself that letters from soldiers must take longer. Meanwhile, her father grew impatient with her mood. "You are distracted," he said one evening over dinner. "I am not," she replied automatically. "You are, and you spend too much time outside. You are not a tourist." "I am not an investment either," she shot back. He sighed. "You cannot stay here forever without contributing properly." The word properly stung. "I contribute," she said. "I cook, I clean, I am trying." "You are restless," he observed. "It is disruptive." Disruptive, as if grief and waiting were inconveniences. 3 weeks after mailing her letter, she sent another, this one shorter. "Please write, just so I know." No reply came. What she did not know was that in the quiet of Theodore's family home, envelopes addressed to her were being opened by hands that were not his. Letters written from a barracks, careful and hopeful, were read, folded, and placed into a drawer. The following week, her father placed a stack of documents in front of her. "You should consider returning to France," he said. "You seem unhappy here." She stared at the papers. "You want me to leave?" "I want you to be realistic." Realistic felt like another word for unwanted. That night, she packed her suitcase again. The wooden box went inside first. She stood in the boarding room for a long moment, remembering the first night she cried there. She felt different now, not stronger, just more aware. At the train station the next morning, she did not look back at the city. On the journey south, she pressed her forehead to the window and whispered, "You could have told me." She returned to France with little money and no answers. The cafe remained closed. Dust still clung to the tables. When Liliana returned to the south of France, the cafe still smelled faintly of coffee grounds and lemon peel. Dust coated the tables like a thin accusation. The next morning, she unlocked the door and stood in the center of the room with her hands on her hips. "All right," she said aloud. "We are not dying here." No letter had arrived. 2 weeks later, she had scrubbed every surface, repainted the shutters, and reopened with a small handwritten sign that read, "Back soon." She did not know if that meant customers or happiness. Every afternoon at 3, she walked to the mailbox at the corner. She told herself it was routine, exercise, fresh air. She did not admit that her heart still lifted slightly before she opened it. Nothing. The following week, she hired a teenage boy to help serve tables. "You look serious," he told her one morning while stacking cups. "I am serious." "You frown at the sugar bowl." "I do not." "You do." She caught her reflection in the cafe window and forced herself to soften her face. She did not want to become someone who frowned at sugar bowls. Months passed. The cafe regained regular customers. She learned to smile without feeling like she was betraying something. She laughed when an elderly man spilled his coffee and insisted the cup had attacked him first. Still, at 9 o'clock each evening, she glanced at the clock without meaning to. A year later, she stopped expecting a letter every day. She still checked the mailbox, but less urgently. When neighbors asked if she was seeing anyone, she shrugged. "I'm busy," she would say. Busy felt respectable. 5 years after leaving Vienna, she noticed one afternoon that she had not checked the mailbox in 3 days. The realization startled her more than the absence ever had. That evening, she sat at a small table inside the cafe, after closing and opened her mother's wooden box. The letters inside felt older now, like artifacts instead of clues. "I cannot keep waiting for a ghost," she murmured. But she did not throw the box away. The next morning, a man named Mark came in for coffee. He had been visiting for months, always ordering the same thing, always sitting by the window with a newspaper. "You run this place well," he said casually as she handed him his cup. "I try." "You do more than try." She studied him. He was neat, well-dressed, reliable in the way of men who pay bills on time. 2 weeks later, he asked if she would join him for dinner. "You look like someone who needs to leave this room occasionally," he said. "I leave," she replied. "You walk to the mailbox." She blinked. "How do you know that?" "Because I see you." The words unsettled her. The dinner was pleasant. He asked practical questions. Where do you see yourself in 5 years? Do you plan to expand? He spoke about investments and long-term plans. He did not speak about art or rooftops or 9 o'clock promises. 10 years after Vienna, she married him in a small ceremony by the sea. She wore a simple dress. He looked proud. That night, as they sat at the edge of their bed, he said, "We will build something stable." She nodded. Stable sounded safe. Safe sounded intelligent. The first year of marriage felt efficient. They moved into a modest apartment above the cafe. He helped with bookkeeping. He suggested renovations that made sense financially. "You should franchise," he said one evening, reviewing numbers. "I do not want 5 cafes," she replied. "Why not? You could. I do not want to manage something that large. You are limiting yourself." She leaned back in her chair. "Or I am choosing my limits." He frowned. "Ambition is not a crime." "I know that," she said quietly, "but not everyone wants the same kind." The arguments were never explosive. They were steady, like water dripping onto stone. Small disagreements about risk, about expansion, about whether she should sell and move to the city. "You are capable of more," he insisted one afternoon. "More what?" she asked. "More growth." She wanted to say I already grew once and it nearly broke me, but she did not. She had never told him about Theodore, not about the clock tower, not about letters that never arrived. Instead, she said, "This is enough for me." He looked at her carefully. "You always seem to be waiting for something." The sentence landed harder than he intended. "I am not waiting," she replied too quickly. "You look out the window at 9 o'clock, he said gently. "Every night." She laughed, hoping it sounded casual. "Habit." "Habit for what?" She opened her mouth and closed it again. She could not explain without reopening a door she had nailed shut. Years passed in this quiet pattern. They were not unhappy in a loud way. They were not happy in a loud way either. They functioned. 15 years after Vienna, she found herself standing in the kitchen of their apartment, staring at a calendar while Mark spoke about an investment opportunity. "You are not listening," he said. "I am." "You are somewhere else." She almost told him then, about a boy who painted tomatoes like ambition, about promises in the rain. Instead, she said, "I am tired." By the 19th year after she had stood under the Vienna clock tower, the marriage felt thin. No betrayal, no shouting matches, just exhaustion. The conversation that ended it happened on a Tuesday morning over coffee. "I think we want different things," she said carefully. "We have always wanted different things," Mark replied. "I thought that was manageable." "So did I." He studied her face. "Are you leaving for someone?" "No," she said honestly. "I am leaving because I do not feel like myself." There were lawyers, papers, dividing assets that never felt fully shared. 5 months after the divorce was finalized, she stood alone inside the cafe at closing time, older now. Lines at the corners of her eyes that had nothing to do with laughter. She wiped down the counter slowly and glanced at the clock. 9 o'clock. The ache that used to accompany that hour had softened over the years. It was no longer sharp. It felt like a distant echo. "I am not waiting," she whispered to the empty room. But part of her still wondered who, if anyone, had been waiting for her. 5 months after the divorce papers were signed, Liliana decided to repaint the cafe. It was not a business decision. It was not strategic. It was something between rebellion and therapy. The walls had been cream for years because Mark said cream appealed to the widest demographic. She chose a warmer shade without consulting anyone. "The place looks alive again," her neighbor Colette said the week before reopening night, peeking through the door. "It was never dead," Liliana replied, standing on a ladder with a paintbrush in her hand. "It looked tired." Liliana paused. "So did I." On the morning of the reopening celebration, she woke earlier than necessary. The sea air drifted through her bedroom window, carrying salt and the faint sound of fishermen arguing. She lay there, staring at the ceiling, her mind oddly restless. "It is just a party," she told herself. "There will be wine, there will be music, you will smile." By late afternoon, small lights were strung across the patio. A local guitarist tuned his instrument near the door. People began arriving at sunset, bringing flowers and polite curiosity. "You look happy," Colette said again, handing her a bottle of wine. "I am functional," Liliana corrected, then laughed at herself. "I am happy enough." As evening settled in, the cafe filled with warm noise. Glasses clinked. Someone spilled olives. A man complimented the new wall color as if she had painted it personally for him. Later that evening, just as the sky turned darker and the music softened, Liliana stepped outside to catch her breath. She leaned against the doorframe and inhaled slowly. That was when she saw him. A man stood across the street, slightly angled toward the cafe, a sketchbook in his hand. He was not young. His hair was darker at the roots, but streaked with grey at the temples. His shoulders were broader. There was a faint scar along his jaw. She recognized the way he held the pencil before she recognized his face. Her body reacted before her mind did. Her breath caught, not loudly, but enough that she felt it. "No," she thought, "no." He looked up. Time did not stop. The guitarist kept playing inside. Someone laughed too loudly. A glass broke. But between them, something tightened. He took a step forward. She did not move. When he reached the edge of the patio, he lowered the sketchbook slowly, as if placing something fragile on a table. "Liliana," he said. His voice was older, steadier. She swallowed. "Theodore." The name felt unfamiliar in her mouth after so many years of silence. For a moment, neither of them spoke. She became aware of her own hands, unsure what to do with them. "You look," he began, then stopped. "Different?" she offered. "Yes. So do you." A small, almost awkward smile flickered between them and disappeared just as quickly. "I wrote," he said finally. The words were not a greeting. They were an accusation of fate. Her chest tightened. "You didn't." "I did." She shook her head immediately. "I waited. There was nothing." His jaw tightened slightly. "I wrote for years." Anger rose faster than reason. Then where were they? He opened his sketchbook not to show a drawing, but to reveal folded papers tucked inside the back cover. "I kept copies," he said. "I thought one day I would show you." Her hands trembled despite her effort to remain steady. "Show me what?" He pulled out one sheet and handed it to her. The paper was worn at the edges. She recognized his handwriting instantly. Even older, it carried the same careful slope. "I do not know where you are now, but I hope this finds you. I paint when I can. I think of 9 o'clock. Her throat tightened. "This could have been written yesterday." "It was written 18 years ago," he replied quietly. She looked up at him sharply. "You expect me to believe that someone lost hundreds of letters?" "Yes." "Who?" His silence answered before he did. "My father," he said finally. "He admitted it after I returned." She felt heat rush to her face. "Returned from where?" "Service," he replied. "It was not optional." The noise from inside the cafe felt distant now. She could hear her own pulse. "I went to your house," she said. "He told me you needed discipline." Theodore let out a short breath that was not laughter. "That sounds like him. You could have sent something another way." "I tried," he insisted. "When I came back, he told me you had left Vienna, that you did not ask about me." She stared at him. "I went to your house 3 nights in a row. I was already gone." They stood facing each other, two people carrying the same wound, but blaming different versions of the past. "Why now?" she asked, her voice quieter. "Why are you here now?" He hesitated, then answered honestly, "Because I never stopped wondering if you thought I abandoned you." The word abandoned landed heavily between them. "I thought you did," she said. "I did not." A group of guests spilled out onto the patio, laughing loudly. One of them paused, sensing the tension. "Liliana, are you coming back inside?" Colette called. "In a moment," she replied without turning. When the guests retreated, she looked at the stack of copied letters still in his hand. "How many?" she asked. "Hundreds," he said. "Not all long. Some only a page, some only a few lines. I wrote whenever I could." "And you never married?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. "No," he answered simply. "I did not." She searched his face for signs of hesitation, and found none. I did, she said almost defensively. I was married. I know, he replied gently. I asked about you before coming. And you still came? Yes. The sea breeze moved between them, carrying the sound of waves against the shore. I do not know what to do with this, she admitted, holding up one of the letters. You do not have to decide tonight, he said. I only needed you to know I wrote. She studied him again, this older version of the boy who once painted tomatoes like ambition. Stay, she said finally, surprising herself. Not forever, just stay for a drink. He nodded, relief passing briefly across his face. As they stepped inside the cafe together, she felt something she had not felt in years. Not certainty, not forgiveness, but the return of a question she had buried long ago. If he wrote, then who kept them? The next morning, the sea was louder than either of them. Liliana had not slept much. She kept replaying the night before in her mind, Theodore standing outside her cafe with that sketchbook saying, I wrote, like it was both a defense and a confession. By the time the sun came up over the coastline, she had already had 2 coffees and one unnecessary argument with herself in the mirror. At 9, he was waiting near the path that curved along the water. He had his hands in his coat pockets like he used to when he was nervous, shoulders slightly forward, as if apologizing to the air. You look the same when you're anxious, she said instead of hello. He glanced up. That is not true. It is. You hunch. I do not hunch. She raised an eyebrow. He straightened immediately. She almost smiled, then remembered she was still angry. They began walking along the coastline, the waves breaking in a steady rhythm beside them. For a few minutes neither spoke. The silence felt heavy, but not empty. Finally he said quietly, I should start at the beginning. You should, she replied. He nodded. After I was taken, I was sent east. Training first, then deployment. I kept writing you from the barracks, short letters, stupid ones. I did not want to worry you. You succeeded, she said flatly. He inhaled, then continued. The first year I believed you were receiving them. I imagined you reading them aloud in your kitchen, making fun of my handwriting. She looked at him sharply. I never got one. I know that now. They walked a few more steps. The sea breeze tugged at her hair. I was injured 2 years in, he went on. Nothing heroic, a fall, a fracture that healed badly. I spent months in recovery. I wrote more then, longer letters. I told you about the hospital food, about the man in the next bed who snored like a tractor. I thought if I kept it normal, it would feel normal. She let out a short, surprised laugh despite herself. A tractor. Yes, you would have hated him. I probably would have. There it was again, that dangerous ease. He grew serious. When I was discharged and sent back home, I asked my father if there had been letters from you. He said no. He said you had moved on quickly, that you had not written once. Her stomach twisted. He told me you needed discipline, like I was a bad habit. His jaw tightened. The scar there caught the light. 3 months after I returned, I found a bundle in his study, tied with string, addressed to me. Her breath stopped. From me? He nodded. Dozens, unopened. He said he was protecting me from distraction, that I needed to build a proper life. She felt a strange urge to laugh, but it came out unsteady. We were 18. We were inconvenient, he said. They stopped walking. The waves rolled in, indifferent to history. I confronted him, Theodore continued. He admitted he had intercepted my letters to you as well, said you would have dragged me into uncertainty, said he had done what was necessary. Liliana stared at the horizon. So we were faithful to lies. I left Vienna a week later, he said. I did not tell him where I was going. And you never tried to find me? I did, he said quickly. I went to your old address. The neighbors said you had left. No one knew where. Your father would not answer my letters. Her throat tightened. He barely answered mine either. They resumed walking, slower now. I told myself, Theodore said carefully, that if you were silent, it meant you had chosen peace. I tried to respect that. I was not at peace, she replied. He looked at her, waiting. She exhaled. Months passed after I returned here. I rebuilt the cafe, I checked the mailbox every morning. I even checked twice in the evenings as if the postman might feel generous. Nothing ever came. He closed his eyes briefly. 5 years later, she went on, I stopped running to the door when it clicked. 10 years later, I married someone sensible. The practical man, he said softly. She glanced at him. Yes, practical. Stable. He believed in budgets and safe investments and not quitting things halfway. And you? I believed in expanding the cafe into a second location, she said. He believed that was risky and unnecessary. We argued about small things, chairs, paint colors, whether dreams should come with a backup plan. And Theodore? He asked quietly. I never said your name. They walked in silence again. 19 years after Vienna, she continued, I signed divorce papers at my own kitchen table. No shouting, no betrayal, just exhaustion. He nodded slowly. You deserved more. I deserved clarity, she corrected. We both did. Later that week, Theodore suggested they look somewhere private, somewhere he felt the letters might still exist. Liliana agreed, a mix of nervousness and hope tightening her chest. They arrived at a narrow, dusty staircase tucked behind a side alley in Vienna, inside the old family estate where Theodore's father had lived. The building smelled of varnish, old paper, and years of neglect. Theodore hesitated at the bottom. I never showed anyone this place, he said quietly. Why would you show me now? Liliana asked, trying not to let her voice shake. Because, he said, we need to see the truth ourselves. Step by step they climbed. Each stair creaked underfoot, echoing like a memory. At the top, a small attic room waited, cluttered with trunks, crates, and dust-covered furniture. Sunlight peeked through a grimy window, catching motes that floated lazily in the air. I haven't been up here since... Theodore trailed off, swallowing. Since your father decided life should be orderly, Liliana offered. He gave a small, bitter smile. Something like that. They began sifting through crates, pulling out old books, broken frames and scraps of canvas. Liliana felt her heart beat faster, expecting nothing yet, hoping for everything. Then Theodore froze. His hand hovered over a worn wooden trunk at the corner. The lid was slightly warped. Liliana noticed how his fingers hesitated. This one, he said carefully. She bent closer. What is it? I'm not sure if you're ready, he replied, then lifted the lid. Inside were stacks of letters, tied with string, yellowed with age but remarkably preserved. Hundreds of them, all in Theodore's handwriting. Liliana's breath caught. You wrote all these? I did, he said softly, and my father hid them. He thought he was protecting me and you. She blinked, trying to process the magnitude of what she was seeing. So, all this time, all those years, he kept your letters from me? Yes, Theodore said quietly, his jaw tight. He claimed it was for discipline, to keep me focused, to prevent me from wasting myself on uncertainty. Liliana's hands shook as she picked up a letter. The ink, slightly faded, was unmistakably his. We were faithful to ghosts, she whispered, and a laugh bubbled up from somewhere inside her, half joy, half disbelief, half heartbreak. Theodore took a letter gently from the pile and handed it to her. I kept copies just in case. I never stopped hoping that one day you'd know I never stopped writing. She traced the words with a trembling finger, tears spilling over. 300 letters, maybe more. And I kept copies of all of them, he said softly, eyes meeting hers. I wanted the truth to survive, even if my father tried to bury it. Liliana laughed through the tears, shaking her head. We built entire lives around silence. Yes, he replied, a small, helpless smile on his face. But at least now the silence is finally gone. They sat together on the dusty floor, surrounded by the lost years stacked neatly in envelopes, and for the first time in decades, Liliana felt a shift in her chest. It wasn't the pain that had left, not entirely, but it had changed shape. It was no longer a question mark over her life. It was an answer, and this time it had arrived, 2 days after the attic discovery, Theodore suggested a trip outside the city. Liliana hesitated at first. The thought of leaving the familiar streets of the cafe and her apartment made her stomach twist, but she also recognized the pull of something she had missed for years: light air, open space, and a chance to see him outside the shadows of old walls. They drove in silence at first, winding through narrow roads that eventually opened onto rolling vineyards. The sun was low, warm against the leaves, and the smell of crushed grapes mingled with the distant scent of wildflowers. Liliana felt her chest tighten, not from beauty but from the weird, uncomfortable flutter of hope. "What if we only loved who we were at 18? She asked quietly, staring out the car window. Her words barely rose above the engine hum. Theodore glanced at her, hands steady on the wheel. "Then let's meet who we are now," he said simply. She turned toward him. His eyes were softer than she remembered, though lined with something life had taught him. She wasn't sure if it was relief or fear that made her stomach churn. They parked near a small winery and wandered between rows of vines, their fingers brushing occasionally, lingering just enough to remind them that touch had meaning again. The air was warm and slightly sticky from the ripening grapes, and it felt strange to breathe without the weight of unspoken letters pressing on her chest. Later that afternoon, he led her to a small art gallery tucked on the edge of town. "I want you to see something," he said, a trace of nervousness in his voice. She walked inside, expecting landscapes and still lifes. Instead, she found him. Her face, her profile, her expression captured in oil and charcoal. Each piece carried a memory, not of just him, but of them together. The clock tower, the rainstorm, the cafes, the narrow canals. Liliana laughed nervously, a sharp, breathy sound. "You're obsessed." Theodore raised a brow. "Consistency," he replied, grinning. "And also talent, but mostly consistency." She shook her head, trying to mask the way her heart was pulling in two directions. Toward him, and toward the safety of not hoping too hard. "This is a lot," she said, sitting on a bench in the corner. "I mean, it's beautiful, but also terrifying. You've painted me 100 times, and I'm scared." "Scared?" he asked, leaning against the wall, arms crossed. "Yes," she admitted. "Scared that I'll try again and fail, that we'll only remember being young and foolish, that the past will ruin the present." Theodore smiled gently. "Liliana, I am not asking you to forget anything. I am asking you to show me who you are now. No 18-year-old, no 21-year-old, just you today, that's all I want." She studied him. It was tempting, dangerous. He was older, steady, confident in a way he hadn't been when she first met him, yet somehow tender and careful. She wanted to run to him, to leap, to trust, but the muscles of caution were tight from 19 years of heartbreak. "So you're saying there's no pressure?" she asked, half in disbelief. "Zero," he said. "No ultimatums, no timelines, we take it slow or fast or somewhere in between." She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "And you're serious?" "I've never been more serious," he replied. "I spent all those years writing letters I never thought you'd see. Do you think I'd now rush what we've spent decades losing?" Her lips twitched. "You have a way with guilt disguised as romance." He laughed, a low, warm sound that made her want to melt and glare at him at the same time. "That's an art too, I think." They walked through the gallery again, her fingers brushing the frames as if she could absorb courage through her skin. Each painting reminded her of a version of herself she had long buried, the girl who had loved without calculation, who had hoped without knowing the consequences. She stopped before one particularly detailed portrait, her face framed in sunlight, hair catching the breeze, eyes wide and unafraid. Her throat tightened. "You painted me as brave," she said quietly. "I did," he said. "Because you were, because you still are, even when you don't feel it." She shook her head, laughing through a lump in her throat. "I don't know if I can live up to this version of me, or to you." "Then live up to no one," he said gently. "We're not trying to replicate the past. We're just here." Later, outside, they wandered through the vineyard as the sun dipped lower, spilling gold across the rows. Liliana felt the tension of 19 years lift a fraction. She could still be hurt, still be cautious, but she could also begin to imagine hope again, small, fragile, but undeniably present. "Promise me one thing," she said. "What?" "Don't rush me. Don't make me pretend I'm fearless." "I promise," he said. "I'll wait for you to show me for real this time." She nodded, a quiet smile breaking through the tension she hadn't realized she carried. It was the first time in years she felt she could breathe, fully and without guilt. Healing, she realized, did not arrive all at once. It came carefully, like sunlight over grapes, gentle and slow, coloring everything with warmth. And at the moment she considered that maybe, just maybe, she could love again without fear. Months had passed since the vineyard trip. Liliana had reopened her cafe fully, spent mornings arranging pastries, afternoons reorganizing the little library she kept for herself, and evenings sketching the view from the terrace. Yet, beneath the steady rhythm of her life, a quiet anticipation pulsed every time she heard from Theodore. Finally, they agreed to return to Vienna together. It wasn't an impulsive decision. It was measured, cautious, as if the city itself had to approve before they could step fully into it. Liliana felt a flicker of nerves on the train. She clutched her bag tightly, half expecting to be that same 17-year-old girl again, lost among foreign streets. Theodore sensed her tension. He reached across and brushed her hand with his fingers. "You don't have to be the girl from before," he said quietly. "You're the woman you've become." She looked at him, caught between laughter and tears. "I hope she's allowed to be brave." He smiled, and the gesture alone eased some of the tension. 2 days later, they wandered the familiar streets near the canal. The city had shifted slightly. Cafes had changed signs. Buildings had new coats of paint. But the clock tower still stood, resolute, its hands frozen over history and memory. At precisely 9 in the evening, they arrived at the base of the tower. The cobblestones echoed under their shoes. Liliana felt the old pulse of anxiety, that sharp reminder of a goodbye never given, of letters that never arrived, of years wasted in silence. Theodore took a deep breath. "Liliana," he said, voice low, steady, "I need to apologize." Her heart tightened. "For what?" she asked, though she knew. "For leaving you, for disappearing without a word, for all the letters you never received because my father interfered. I never should have let it happen. You deserved more than that silence." She looked at him, searching his eyes for something, anything. She remembered the girl who had waited by the clock tower 19 years ago, heart raw and exposed. "I forgive you," she said finally. Her voice shook. "And I forgive myself, for expecting more from a boy, for waiting so long, for letting it hurt this much." A wave of relief passed between them. Theodore's shoulders loosened. He reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers. Later, they walked along the canal. Liliana's gaze lingered on the water, the reflection of the street lamps shimmering like fragmented memories. "We were children," she said softly. 19 years ago, we were just children trying to figure out love." Theodore nodded, staring at the gentle ripples. "We survived," he replied, "and somehow we found our way back." She smiled, a mixture of pride, wonder, and residual ache. "And now?" she asked, glancing at him. "Now," he said, turning to face her fully, "we decide." He reached into his coat pocket. Not for a box, not for flourish, not for a gesture anyone would call dramatic. He simply pulled out a small folded note he had been carrying for weeks, written in the same careful hand she remembered from all those years. He handed it to her. "Stay, this time stay." Liliana blinked, reading the simple words. No pressure, no fanfare, just a request from someone who had loved her through decades of absence, through silence, through everything. Tears pricked her eyes, but she laughed softly, the sound mingling with the faint lapping of the canal water. "You make it sound so easy," she said. "It is easy," he said gently, "only if we want it to be, only if we choose it now." She folded the note carefully and slipped it into her pocket. Then, without thinking, she leaned into him, resting her forehead against his chest. "I choose," she whispered. "You choose," he repeated, pressing his cheek to the top of her head. "And I will keep choosing you every day for as long as we can." They walked along the canal slowly, hand in hand, letting the lights of the city glow around them. There was no weight pressing down, no unanswered letters, no silences stretching into decades. There was only now. Later that evening, they found a quiet cafe along the canal, one neither had noticed before. They shared a simple meal, laughter spilling between them as if it had always been waiting for this moment. Liliana marveled at how ordinary it felt, how safe, how real. And yet every glance at Theodore reminded her of everything extraordinary they had survived. The pain, the loss, the decades of waiting. It all became a part of their story, not a shadow over it. And for once in her adult life, she allowed herself to feel completely, unapologetically, and with a sense of trust she hadn't thought possible. The past was no longer a chain, it was a foundation. Vienna, the canals, the clock tower, they were witnesses. And this time Liliana and Theodore would not leave without saying everything they meant, and without choosing to stay together. And so, under the soft glow of the evening lamps, they began the next chapter. Together, awake and fully present, two adults finally willing to love without hesitation. A year had passed since that evening by the canal in Vienna, the night they had chosen each other without fanfare or pressure. Liliana's cafe thrived along the quiet seaside street in southern France, a place she had rebuilt with her own hands, now filled with the aroma of fresh bread, roasted coffee, and the soft hum of conversation. The studio behind the cafe was a small sunlit room where Theodore painted. Canvases leaned against the walls, each capturing moments of their shared life. The clock tower, the rainstorm, the vineyards, and the quiet streets of the village. Some were abstract, full of light and color. Others were intimate portraits of Liliana herself. He hummed softly while he worked, and sometimes, without realizing it, she watched him from the cafe doorway, feeling the steady pulse of their life together. The following morning, she moved through the cafe arranging chairs for the weekly art night. A few locals and travelers would come, bringing guitars or notebooks, sketchbooks or canvases. It was casual, chaotic, and exactly what she wanted. Theodore peeked his head around the studio door. "You're rearranging again?" he asked, a teasing smile on his lips. "I'm ensuring optimal creativity flow," she replied, waggling her eyebrows. "It's scientifically proven." "You mean you like chaos disguised as science?" he countered, grinning. She laughed. "Perhaps, but it works." Later that evening, as the cafe filled with people laughing, sketching, and spilling paint, Theodore placed a cup of tea on her table. "I was thinking," he said, "we could frame a few of the lost letters on the wall, as a reminder of where we've been and how far we've come." Liliana's fingers brushed the edge of the cup. 300 letters, all hidden, all years of waiting. She shook her head, smiling softly. "It's absurd, but beautiful. They're part of our story," he said, "and now they can stay with us, without holding anything hostage." She nodded, remembering the girl who had arrived in Vienna at 17, clutching a small box of her mother's letters, terrified and untethered. The weight she had carried for 19 years had been enormous, but it had led her here, to this moment, where the past existed as texture and color, not as chains. The next morning, she opened the cafe doors to the sea breeze, watching the waves break and recede, rhythmic and unending. Theodore joined her, carrying a sketchpad and a small brush. "I like that the ocean is always in motion," he said. "It reminds me that we can keep moving, too." "Even after waiting for years?" she asked. "Especially after waiting," he said, "because waiting shows you what's worth staying for." 2 weeks later, one of their art nights featured a local musician. Theodore painted her while she watched the performer, capturing her in strokes of blues and ochres, laughter caught mid-air. Liliana noticed a few patrons glancing at the paintings on the wall. The letters framed, the moments captured, the life rebuilt, and she felt something she hadn't in a long time, a sense of completion, though not perfection. Later that evening, the clock struck 9. Liliana and Theodore were cleaning up the studio. Their hands brushed while reaching for the same canvas, and for a moment they paused, just smiling at each other. No words were needed. The ritual of 9 o'clock had survived, but now it was gentle, a soft acknowledgement of everything and nothing all at once. "Do you ever think about the girl with the box?" Theodore asked quietly as they stepped outside. the night air cool against their skin. She paused, thinking. Every now and then, I remember her fear, her hope. But it's no longer sharp. It's softened by time, by experience, by us. He nodded, reaching for her hand. She made us who we are now, and we're better than we imagined. Later, she stood in the cafe doorway, looking at the framed letters on the wall. Each envelope, yellowed and tied with string, was a testament to patience, to perseverance, to love that refused to be erased. Some heartbreaks do not end love, she whispered, almost to herself. They prepare it. Theodore joined her silently. He draped an arm over her shoulder, and they watched the sun dip below the horizon, spilling gold across the water and painting the cafe in soft light. They were no longer haunted by lost years. The past had become texture, not weight. Inside the studio, the paints and brushes waited, ready to capture new moments. Outside, the cafe hummed with life, laughter, and warmth. And between the walls and the sea, Liliana and Theodore found the quiet, steady rhythm of a love chosen freely, fully, and without fear. The final image was simple. A stack of once-lost letters framed neatly on the wall, a symbol of endurance, proof that even long silence could give way to lasting connection. The girl with the box had grown into a woman living fully, and the boy who wanted color had become a man painting a life they both finally deserved. In the soft glow of the evening, they remained side by side, not broken, not haunted, but whole, with the past folded gently into memory and the future wide open before them.